Hello and welcome to another episode of True Historical Fiction. This time I will clear up a question that has been burning on many people's tongues lately. Why isn't Prince Harry's son Archie a prince too? Why isn't Prince Harry's son Archie a prince too? You may have heard that it has to do with some old rule that states the Queen's great-grandchildren aren't given the title of prince or princess. But why then are all of Prince William's children princes and princess? Aren't Harry's children entitled to the same, since he is also the son of the Crown Prince of England? The reason that Archie doesn't have a title relates to a letter patent, some obscure extended royal family members, and the Great War. I will explain how all of these things correlate, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly why Archie doesn't have a title. Now it is time for a quick lesson in some slightly obscure royal family members who are all unsurprisingly related to Queen Victoria. Before I begin, just beware that this next part might get a little confusing and hard to follow, as the royals tend to have an affinity for using the same names over and over again, and most of the people I'm going to mention you have probably never heard of before. But bear with me because they are important to this explanation. So here goes. I will start with some more familiar royals and work my way towards the less familiar. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, she assumed his name, being of the house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When they had children, they passed that name on to them, and when their sons had children, they passed that name on to their children, and so on. You get the picture. What's the big deal about that? Well, for one thing, the royal family does not go by the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha anymore, but I will get into more detail about that soon. The point is simply that Albert was of the house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His father was the first sovereign duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Ernst I. Albert had an older brother, also named Ernst, and the two of them were their father's only legitimate sons. So, when Ernst I died in 1844, his oldest legitimate son, Ernst, became Ernst II of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Are you still with me? Ernst II, though he was married, was never able to produce an heir. So, when he died in 1893, someone had to fill his place. His brother Albert was already dead, so they would have to find someone else. Who would be the next sovereign duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha? The answer was Victoria and Albert's second oldest son, Alfred, since their oldest son would become the future King of England, Edward VII, upon his mother's death. So, Alfred took his place as the third Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The good news was that he already had a teenage son who could succeed him when he died. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was now secure with a duke and an heir already lined up, right? Wrong. No one is entirely certain of the circumstances leading to Prince Alfred's son Alfred's death. Some say that his health just suddenly broke down, while others claim that he succumbed to consumption. But the most widely believed story goes that he shot himself right around his parents' 25th wedding anniversary because of a scandal that he and his mistress were involved in. He survived the shot and was sent in shame to recover in Meran, where he died a few weeks later. He was Prince Alfred's only son, so when he himself died in 1900, the search for a new Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha once again commenced. This time it landed in the lap of Queen Victoria's youngest son, Leopold's oldest son, Leopold. No, I'm just kidding. His name was Leopold, but he went by his first two middle names, Charles and Edward. In case you're a little confused by this point, here's a quick recap. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha went from Prince Albert's father Ernst I, then to Prince Albert's older brother Ernst II. He was succeeded by his second oldest nephew, Prince Alfred, who was succeeded by his youngest brother's oldest son, Charles Edward. I meant it when I said obscure relatives. Now, let's pause this story at the year 1917. Most of the people I just mentioned are dead, except for Prince Leopold's son, Charles Edward, who is still the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. You're going to want to remember him. Now we're going to take a look at two more obscure royal relatives and then I promise we will get back to Prince Harry and Archie. We start once again at Queen Victoria, but this time instead of going down her family tree, we will go up to her grandfather George III, King of the United Kingdom of Britain and Hanover. When King George III died, he was succeeded by his oldest son, who became George IV. When he died without an heir, because his only daughter died, and his next youngest brother was also dead, the throne passed on to his yet again younger brother, William, who became William IV. After King William IV also died without an heir, the throne was passed on to his younger brother's only child, a daughter named Alexandrina Victoria. In 1837, at the age of 18, she became Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom of Britain. According to the Hanoverian rules of succession, however, Victoria could not inherit the throne of Hanover since she was not a man. So the throne of Hanover went to her uncle, Ernst Augustus, the fifth son of George III. After he died, his oldest son became George V of Hanover, and he had a son named Ernst Augustus, who also named his son Ernst Augustus. The two latter names belong to the two other aforementioned obscure royal relatives. Now back to the year 1917. The Great War rages on, and Europe's kingdoms are forced to oppose one another. Britain is on the Allied side of the war, so naturally are the royal family. There's a hitch, though. Remember their last name? Saxe-Coburg and Gotha? That sounds pretty German, doesn't it? And it did to the British people, too. Scared of what his subjects might think or say or do to him and his family, King George V decided in July of 1917 to change the name of the royal household from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, the name the British royal family still uses to this day. Now, remember those obscure royal relatives? Charles Edward, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Ernst Augustus, Crown Prince of Hanover, and his son Ernst Augustus all swore allegiance to the Germans during the Great War. The problem with this was that all three of them had British titles. If George V went to the trouble of changing the royal household's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor on the account that it sounded too German, how could he condone having relatives with British titles fighting on the German side of the war? Enter the Titles Deprivation Act of December 1917. This act, created by George V, basically meant that only the monarch's children and grandchildren could bear the titles of prince or princess, and the oldest son of his oldest grandson, being an heir to the throne, could also bear the title of prince. This would limit the chance of having relatives with British titles fighting on opposing sides during wars. Instead of taking the titles away from just these three relatives, George V decided to pare down the number of royals with titles in general. So what does that mean nowadays, and why doesn't Archie have a title? Queen Elizabeth II is the current reigning monarch of the UK of Britain. Her children are Prince Charles, Princess Anne, and Princes Andrew and Edward, respectively. Their children are the grandchildren of the Queen, and therefore can also bear the titles of Prince or Princess should their parents choose this for them. Princess Anne chose that her children shouldn't bear titles. Now, the Queen's grandchildren's children, except for Prince William's oldest son, do not qualify for titles as outlined in the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917. So why are Prince William's other children, Princess and Prince too? This has to do with an amendment that Queen Elizabeth II made to the Titles Deprivation Act, which made it possible for all of her oldest grandson's children to bear a title. Archie is not the son of the oldest grandson of the monarch, therefore he and all of the Queen's other great-grandchildren, with the exception of Prince William's children, are not allowed to bear a title. So in short, the reason that Archie does not have a title is because a great-grandson and two twice-great-grandsons of a former monarch of the UK of Britain fought on the wrong side of the war during World War I. So yes, the reason that Archie doesn't have a title relates to racism, but has nothing to do with him or his parents personally. It goes back over 100 years in the past to one of the bloodiest wars in history. It was an act of anti-German sentiment. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found its contents enlightening and entertaining. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing, and if you have a video topic recommendation for this channel, let me know about it in the comments section below.